On a late October evening, at exactly 8:17 p.m., my stepsister raised a glass of champagne in front of 146 guests and introduced me the way someone might introduce a spill on a white carpet. "Just a nurse," she said. The room laughed. Not cruel laughter, the polite kind. The kind people give when they assume the joke is safe. My father laughed first. A deep, comfortable laugh that told everyone else it was perfectly acceptable to follow. Crystal glasses hung midair. Someone clinked a fork against a plate. A woman in a red Valentino dress turned halfway toward me, studied my $38 navy dress for exactly 2 seconds, then turned back to the conversation. And just like that, I disappeared. But what my stepsister didn't know, what my father didn't know, what none of the 146 guests at the Briarwood Estate Ballroom knew, was that the man sitting at the head table, the man who had just written a check for $780,000 to fund most of this wedding, additional expenses had been added later, had once died in my hands for exactly 3 minutes and 42 seconds. And I was the one who brought him back. He just hadn't realized it yet. Before I continue, if this story resonates with you, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. And tell me something in the comments. Where are you listening from, and what time is it there right now? I always love seeing where these stories travel. My name is Ava Mercer. I'm 31 years old. I'm an emergency trauma nurse, and this is the story of how my stepsister's most humiliating moment, for me, became the worst mistake of her life. To explain it properly, I have to take you back, not to the wedding, but to the envelope that arrived 19 days before it. It came on a Thursday afternoon. I had just finished a 14-hour shift at Bayfield Regional Trauma Center. The kind of shift where your scrubs smell like antiseptic and adrenaline. My apartment mailbox contained exactly 3 things: a credit card statement, a grocery coupon booklet, and the wedding invitation. Heavy ivory cardstock, letterpress, embossed gold monogram, L and E, Lauren Whitmore and Ethan Caldwell. I ran my thumb across the raised lettering. They'd spelled my name wrong. Again. Ava became Eva. My family had been getting it wrong for 22 years. I opened the envelope on my kitchen counter. There was no +1. Not surprising. Lauren didn't want me at her wedding. She wanted me documented, accounted for, a background prop in the photo she planned to curate for the rest of her life. Growing up in my father's house had always been an exercise in becoming invisible. My dad, Daniel Mercer, married Vanessa Whitmore when I was 10. Lauren was 13. From that day forward, the house rearranged itself around her. Lauren's bedroom had a balcony and a 4-poster bed. Mine was the converted laundry room. Lauren's school portraits lined the hallway in identical silver frames. Mine stayed inside a drawer. Vanessa introduced Lauren as our daughter. I was Daniel's daughter, from before. My father never corrected her, not once. Every Sunday I called him. He'd answer with the same sentence. "Hey, kiddo, give me 2 minutes and I'll call you back." He never did. Sometimes 3 months passed between calls, and when I dialed again, he spoke like nothing had happened, like forgetting me was just scheduling. So when Lauren's invitation arrived, misspelled and minus a guest, I almost threw it away. Almost. Then my phone rang, and it was my father. "Lauren really wants you there," he said. His voice had that warm performance tone he used when someone else was listening. It would mean a lot to her. That should have been my first warning. My father never called for me, only for Lauren. That night, I Googled Ethan Caldwell. You learn things about people when you work in trauma medicine. Curiosity becomes a reflex. Ethan Caldwell, 34 years old, corporate attorney, Northwestern Law, junior partner at Hensley & Burke in Chicago. His father, Thomas Caldwell, was another story entirely. Real estate developer, started with a single apartment building in the early 1990s. By the time he turned 60, his company owned commercial property across 4 states. Estimated net worth, $340 million. Lauren had been dating Ethan for 2 years, and during those 2 years, she had carefully redesigned our family history. I figured it out through Instagram. Lauren had blocked me years ago, but she never bothered making the account private. Photos of Sunday brunches. Photos of my father wearing suits he never owned before. Photos of Vanessa smiling beside catered tables. The captions always said the same thing. Family means everything. The comments followed. You're so blessed. Perfect family. Goals in 112 photos. I didn't appear once. My father managed a True Value hardware store outside Milwaukee. Lauren told people he was in construction supply management. Vanessa once baked cupcakes for school events. Lauren introduced her as a private catering consultant. Everything about our family had been renovated. Paint over drywall cracks. But I didn't fully understand my role in the renovation until 1 week before the wedding. I overheard Lauren on the phone with Vanessa. I had come early to help with something my father claimed he needed. Lauren's voice drifted from the kitchen. We just need her there for the family photos. After that, keep her quiet. The word quiet landed like a door closing. Quiet. That had always been my job. Here's the thing about growing up invisible. You learn to become essential somewhere else. At Bayfield Regional Trauma Center, nobody cared who my sister was marrying. They cared whether my hands were steady. My shift started at 6 a.m. and ended whenever the trauma board cleared. Sometimes that meant 13 hours, sometimes 18. Sometimes you left the hospital and the sky looked wrong because you hadn't seen daylight in so long. 2 weeks before Lauren's wedding, I helped resuscitate a man whose heart stopped in the ER waiting room. We shocked him twice, performed compressions for 9 minutes. He walked out of the hospital 5 days later, holding his daughter's hand. Nobody called me just a nurse that day. Dr. Rachel Klein, our ER director, nominated me the year before for the Midwest Trauma Nursing Award. I won. The plaque sat in my locker. I never told my family. The one time I tried to mention something about work to Lauren, she tilted her head and smiled. That's sweet. Do nurses get trophies now? Vanessa laughed from the kitchen. My father stayed silent. After that, I stopped sharing. The biggest moment of my career happened 4 years ago. Interstate 94. November rain. A semi-truck lost control and jackknifed across 3 lanes. Multiple vehicles. I was driving home after a double shift. I arrived before the ambulances. What happened in the next 52 minutes changed a man's life, and eventually mine. But I'll get to that. The pre-wedding dinner took place at the Caldwell estate. 4 acres outside Lake Forest. White stone mansion. Circle driveway. Valet parking. I arrived in my 10-year-old Honda Civic and sat in the car for a full minute, just breathing. Inside, everything smelled like garden roses and expensive whiskey. Lauren stood in the center of the living room, laughing, perfect posture, her hand resting on Ethan's arm like she'd practiced the pose. I went looking for the restroom. A waiter pointed me down a hallway. That's when I passed Thomas Caldwell's office. The door was open, and something on the wall stopped me. A framed newspaper article. Next to a photograph of a man in a hospital bed. The headline read, "Developer survives interstate crash thanks to off-duty nurse." I glanced at the photo. The man's face was bruised, half covered in bandages. The image was grainy, and trauma patients rarely look the same years later. I didn't recognize him. 3 years is a long time in trauma medicine. Faces blur, memories blur, but something about the headline tugged at me. Before I could read the article, someone spoke behind me. That's the day I got my second life. I turned. Thomas Caldwell stood in the doorway. Tall, silver hair, holding a glass of bourbon. He nodded toward the photo. The nurse who found me on the highway kept me alive until the paramedics arrived. I never got to thank her. I smiled politely. That's incredible. He studied my face for a moment, like he was trying to place something. Then Lauren appeared behind me. "Stop bothering Mr. Caldwell," she snapped quietly. "Come on." She grabbed my arm and pulled me away. Later that evening, introductions happened in the garden. Lauren performed them like a publicist. My mother, Vanessa, runs a catering consultancy. Vanessa beamed. Thomas Caldwell nodded politely. My stepfather, Daniel Mercer, has been in the construction supply industry for 25 years. My father straightened his blazer. Lauren moved to the next guest. She skipped me completely. I stood 3 feet away holding sparkling water. Thomas Caldwell noticed. He gestured toward me. And who is this? Lauren smiled. Oh, that's Ava. She works at a hospital. In some capacity. Thomas looked at me. What do you do, Ava? Before Lauren could redirect the conversation, I answered. I'm a trauma nurse at Bayfield Regional Medical Center. His eyebrows lifted. That must be intense work. Lauren quickly stepped between us. Anyway, Mr. Caldwell, you have to see the floral mock-ups. She steered him away. Later that night, Vanessa pulled me aside near the garden wall. Honey, she said gently, Lauren is under enormous pressure. This wedding is very important to her. I know where this is going, I said. Vanessa smiled that soft smile she always used before locking a door. Just support her, and try not to draw attention. I nodded. I understood. I had understood for 20 years. But that night, something happened. Something small. Something Lauren didn't realize. Across the lawn, Thomas Caldwell was still watching me, and when our eyes met, he frowned slightly, like he had just remembered something, but couldn't quite reach it yet. And that tiny moment, that flicker of recognition, was the first crack in Lauren's perfect story. The crack that would eventually shatter the entire wedding. And none of us knew it yet. 3 nights before the wedding, at exactly 9:42 p.m., my phone buzzed while I was standing over a trauma patient with a collapsed lung. The message was from a number I didn't recognize. It contained only one sentence. This is Margaret Caldwell, Thomas's wife. We'd love to see you at the wedding. I stared at the screen for half a second before sliding the phone back into my pocket. Because at that exact moment, a 22-year-old construction worker was turning blue in front of me. Focus first, everything else later. That's rule number 1 in emergency medicine. The shift that night stretched into 16 hours. 2 car crashes, 1 opioid overdose, a kitchen knife assault, and a middle-aged man who came in clutching his chest while his wife kept repeating that he'd been fine 30 minutes earlier. By the time I finally stepped outside the hospital doors at 7:18 a.m., the sky was turning pale gray. My phone had 3 missed calls. 2 from my father, 1 from Lauren. Lauren never called me, she texted. Commands, instructions, reminders to stay out of the way, which meant the voicemail she left must have been important. I listened to it while sitting in my car. Her voice came through tight and controlled. Ava, you need to answer your phone when I call. The Caldwell family wants to meet everyone at the rehearsal dinner. Please do not say anything embarrassing about the family. Just be normal. Be normal. I replayed that part twice, because it told me everything. Lauren wasn't worried about me embarrassing her. She was worried about me telling the truth. And the truth was very simple. Our father managed a hardware store, Vanessa ran small catering jobs out of their kitchen, and I worked 12-hour trauma shifts, where blood sometimes soaked through the seams of my gloves. None of those things were embarrassing, but they didn't match Lauren's version of reality. I drove home through morning traffic and slept for 5 hours. When I woke up, I noticed something strange. Margaret Caldwell had texted again. Just checking that you received my message. Thomas asked me to make sure you're comfortable tomorrow. Comfortable. That word stayed with me. I'd met Margaret Caldwell only once, at the brunch. She had the calm, watchful presence of someone who had spent decades observing rooms full of powerful people. And the way she looked at me had been different, curious. Like she was examining a detail nobody else had noticed yet. The rehearsal dinner took place the next evening. Oak Ridge Country Club, black tie optional. I arrived 20 minutes early, because nurses are always early. We're trained that way. When someone's heart stops, seconds matter. When you're invisible at family events, arriving early helps too. You get seated before the room fills. You avoid the scanning looks. the whispered introductions. I wore the same navy dress from the brunch, $38 from Target. Simple, clean, and comfortable enough to sit quietly in the corner for 3 hours. The seating chart stood on an easel near the ballroom entrance. Gold calligraphy, white linen background. I scanned the names until I found mine. Table 16, last row, right beside the kitchen doors. My name was spelled Ava this time, but the last name was wrong. Mercier instead of Mercer. 2 mistakes corrected for 1 new mistake. Progress. The ballroom slowly filled with guests wearing dresses that cost more than my car. Lauren floated through the room, greeting people, champagne glass in hand. Perfect posture, perfect smile, perfect performance. Vanessa stood beside her, radiating pride. My father hovered slightly behind them, like a stage prop. I took my seat at table 16. 2 chairs were empty. One was occupied by a college-aged babysitter named Tessa, the other by an older man who introduced himself as one of Ethan's distant cousins. The cousin left after 15 minutes, which meant I spent most of the evening sitting beside Tessa while the ballroom buzzed around us. Lauren finally took the stage at 8:10 p.m. She tapped the microphone lightly. The room quieted. I'd like to start tonight by introducing the most important people in my life. Her voice was smooth, practiced. My mother, Vanessa Whitmore, the woman who taught me grace and determination. Applause. Vanessa dabbed the corner of her eye with a napkin. My stepfather, Daniel Mercer, the man who showed me what real family looks like. More applause. My father raised his glass. Then came the bridesmaids, the college friends, the wedding planner, the florist, the venue coordinator, the Caldwell family, each introduction polished and glowing. And then, Lauren paused, the kind of pause that only someone who understands performance knows how to use. She looked toward the back tables. And this is my stepsister Ava. Another pause, a small smile. Just a nurse. The laughter rolled through the room again, exactly the same as the brunch, polite, automatic. Encouraged by my father's deep laugh, for 3 seconds. Every person in that ballroom looked at me. Then, they looked away. I sat perfectly still, hands folded in my lap, because reacting would have been exactly what Lauren wanted. Across the room, Thomas Caldwell wasn't laughing. He was staring, hard, like someone trying to solve a puzzle. After the introductions, dinner was served. Filet mignon, truffle potatoes, wine I couldn't pronounce. Tessa leaned toward me. I'm sorry about what she said. I shrugged. It's not the worst thing anyone said about nurses. She hesitated. Still, it was rude. Across the room, Ethan was speaking quietly with his father. Thomas Caldwell glanced toward me again, then back at Ethan, then back at me, like something was bothering him. Lauren noticed. I could tell by the way her shoulders stiffened. 30 minutes later, she cornered me in the hallway outside the restrooms. The smile disappeared instantly. Listen carefully, she said. Tomorrow is my wedding. You will sit quietly. You will not talk about your job. And you will not talk to the Caldwell family unless someone speaks to you first. Why not? Because they don't need to hear about trauma wards and dead bodies. She leaned closer. And Ava, don't start telling stories, especially not the ones where you try to make yourself look important. I studied her face. Why did you tell them I have mental health problems? She didn't even blink. Because it explains why you're distant, why you don't attend family events. It protects everyone. You lied about me. I managed the narrative. Her tone was calm, almost bored. You think the Caldwell family wants to marry into a family where the sister works night shifts and lives alone in a 1-bedroom apartment? They expect stability. They expect success. You're asking me to pretend I don't exist. I'm asking you to know your place. There it was again. Know your place. The sentence my family had been saying without words for 20 years. Lauren opened the door. Vanessa stood outside waiting. Everything okay? Lauren smiled instantly. Just sister stuff. Vanessa looked at me with that same soft, closing door expression. Good. Let's keep it that way tomorrow. They walked back toward the ballroom together, leaving me alone in the hallway. I stood there for a long moment. Then I went outside. The night air felt colder than it should have. I called Dr. Rachel Klein. She answered on the third ring. Everything okay? My sister called me, just a nurse tonight. Rachel exhaled slowly. Ava, you saved 4 lives last month. Just this year, you've worked 1,960 hours in trauma care. You held a man's heart in your hands during an emergency thoracotomy, and he walked out of the hospital 2 weeks later. Don't let anyone shrink what you are. I looked through the ballroom windows. Lauren was laughing, dancing, spinning in a white rehearsal dress. The center of the universe. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel small. I felt calm. Because something was happening in that room that Lauren didn't understand yet. Thomas Caldwell had walked to the bar, and he was staring at me through the glass. Like he was finally starting to remember something important. Something from a rainy highway, 4 years ago. And when a man like Thomas Caldwell starts remembering, everything changes. At 6:35 p.m. the next evening, the wedding ceremony began under a white silk canopy on the Caldwell estate lawn. 212 guests sat in neat rows of ivory chairs. A string quartet played softly. Garden roses lined the aisle, in arrangements flown in from the Netherlands that morning. I know that because I overheard Lauren telling someone they cost $28,000. She sounded proud of the number. I arrived early, earlier than most of the guests. Because if you've ever been the person no one wants in the room, you learn to arrive before the room fills. The earlier you arrive, the fewer eyes there are to notice you. Lauren intercepted me before I reached the seating area. Why are you here already? Her voice was low, tight with irritation. The ceremony starts in 25 minutes. I thought that's when guests arrive. Her smile stayed in place, but her eyes hardened. Stay out of the bridal photos. I'll call you when they need the family shot. She turned and walked away before I could respond. That was the entire conversation. No hello, no welcome, just instructions. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Of course it was. Lauren didn't do anything halfway. Her dress alone cost $11,600. Hand-stitched lace, long cathedral train. The kind of gown designed to be photographed more than worn. Ethan looked genuinely happy. That part surprised me. He seemed like a decent man, which meant one of two things. Either he truly loved Lauren, or he hadn't seen the version of her that I had. Not yet. The vows lasted exactly 11 minutes. Lauren cried on cue, soft, perfect tears. The photographer captured them from 3 different angles. My father walked her down the aisle. He looked proud, like the man beside him wasn't the daughter he'd quietly erased for 2 decades. After the ceremony came the photos. Lauren finally waved me over. Family photo. I stood at the edge of the group, behind Vanessa's shoulder. The photographer took 6 shots. Later that night, Lauren posted one online, in every version she uploaded. My face was cropped out. The reception tent sat behind the main house. White fabric ceiling, crystal chandeliers, fairy lights woven through the support beams. The guest list had grown from the rehearsal dinner. 231 people. The Caldwell name had that effect. The seating chart waited near the entrance. I already knew what to expect. Table 21. The last table. Right beside the catering station. 2 of the chairs were empty. No-shows. Which meant I sat beside an elderly woman who spent the evening talking about cruise vacations. I didn't mind. Being ignored was easier than being watched. Dinner began around 7:40. By 8:10, the speeches started. Lauren's maid of honor spoke first. A childhood story about sleepovers and shared secrets. Then Ethan's best man told a college story involving tequila and a broken pool table. The crowd laughed. Everything moved exactly the way weddings are supposed to move. Predictable. Safe. Controlled. Lauren loved controlled. Then she took the microphone. Her final speech of the night. The one she'd rehearsed for weeks. She stood in the center of the dance floor. Spotlight on her dress. Glass of champagne in her hand. I want to thank every person who helped shape my life. Her voice carried easily through the tent. She thanked Vanessa first. My mother, my best friend, my inspiration. Vanessa cried again. She thanked my father, the man who gave me a real family. He raised his glass. She thanked her bridesmaids, her boss at the marketing firm, her college roommates. She thanked Ethan's parents, my new family, the people who welcomed me with open arms. The crowd applauded. She thanked the florist, the wedding planner, the caterer, even the string quartet. She did not say my name, not once. 231 people clapped, and nobody noticed the omission. Because you can only notice someone missing if you expected them to be there. I sat at table 21 with my hands around a water glass, and I watched my sister erase me in real time. After the speech ended, applause filled the tent. Guests stood, music started. Lauren stepped off the dance floor, glowing with victory. Ethan leaned toward her. I noticed because their table was only 20 feet away. You didn't mention Ava. Lauren smiled softly. She prefers it that way. Trust me. I went to the restroom shortly after. The marble counters gleamed under bright lights. I washed my hands slowly, looked at my reflection. My mother's pearl earrings caught the light. They were the only piece of jewelry she left me before she died. 2 small white pearls. Simple. Quiet. A voice behind me said, "Those are beautiful." I turned. Margaret Caldwell stood near the doorway. Elegant, calm, observing. Thank you. They were my mother's. She studied me for a moment. I noticed Lauren didn't mention you in the speech. I'm used to it. She frowned slightly. No one should be used to that. Before I could answer, the door opened again. Vanessa stepped inside. Everything okay in here? Margaret smiled politely. Just admiring Ava's earrings. Vanessa nodded, then glanced at me. Her eyes said the same thing they always said. Don't make this awkward. We returned to the reception. The band had started playing. People danced. Champagne flowed. Lauren looked like the center of a magazine cover. Perfect lighting, perfect angles, perfect illusion. Around 9:15, something shifted. Thomas Caldwell began walking from table to table, greeting guests, thanking them for coming. When he reached table 21, he didn't shake my hand. He pulled out the empty chair beside me and sat down. You know something strange? His voice was calm, thoughtful. 4 years ago, I almost died on Interstate 94. A truck hit my car during a storm. I was pinned inside the vehicle. He paused, studying my face carefully. For 52 minutes before the ambulance arrived. Someone kept me alive. A woman. She crawled through broken glass to reach me, held my head still so my spine wouldn't move, talked to me the entire time, told me stories, kept me conscious. I listened quietly. Because trauma stories have a rhythm. You recognize them when you work in emergency medicine. The rain, the glass, the smell of gasoline, the distant sound of sirens. But I still hadn't made the connection. 4 years is a long time. Hundreds of patients blur together. Thomas continued. The paramedics told me if she hadn't been there, I wouldn't have survived. He leaned slightly closer. You remind me of her. My heart skipped once, just once, before I could respond. Someone across the tent called his name. Thomas stood, squeezed my shoulder. Sorry, you just look very familiar. He walked away. I watched him disappear into the crowd, and for a moment, I thought that was the end of it. Just another strange conversation at a wedding. But then something happened. Lauren stepped onto the dance floor again and raised the microphone. Attention, everyone! Time for the father-daughter dance! Music began. My father took Lauren's hand. They moved slowly across the floor. Guests watched with soft smiles. The photographer captured every second. It was a beautiful moment. But across the room, Thomas Caldwell wasn't watching the dance. He was staring at his phone, at something on the screen. Then he looked up, directly at me, and suddenly, his entire expression changed. Like a man who had just solved a puzzle that had haunted him for years. He stood up, walked toward me, stopped 2 feet away. His phone was still in his hand. On the screen, I could clearly see a newspaper headline. Local developer survives highway crash thanks to off-duty nurse. He looked at me carefully, almost afraid of the answer. Were you working at Bayfield Regional 4 years ago? Yes. Were you driving home the night of November 3rd? The rain, the accident on I-94. And suddenly, every memory came back at once. The crushed car, the blood, the man trapped behind the wheel, the 52 minutes in the rain. Yes. Thomas inhaled slowly, his eyes filled. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just steadily, like water rising behind glass. It was you. He looked down at my earrings, the pearls. You told me about those. You said they were your mother's. You kept describing them so I wouldn't pass out. My hand touched my ear. The pearl. The same pearl I had worn that night on the highway. Thomas's voice broke quietly. You saved my life. And across the dance floor. Lauren was still smiling, still spinning beneath the lights, completely unaware that the story she had spent years controlling was about to explode in the middle of her perfect wedding. At 9:37 p.m., while the band was finishing the father-daughter dance, Thomas Caldwell was still standing 2 feet in front of me. 231 guests were watching Lauren spin slowly across the dance floor. But Thomas Caldwell was looking only at me. You held my head still in the rain, he said quietly. You kept talking to me. You told me about your mother, about the pearl earrings she wore every day. My hand instinctively touched my ear again. The small white pearl caught the light from the chandeliers. I remembered that night, suddenly, with brutal clarity. The rain had been cold enough to sting. The highway smelled like gasoline and burnt rubber. His car door had been crushed inward, the steering column pressed against his ribs. His breathing had sounded wet. I'd crawled through shattered glass, held his head between my hands so his neck wouldn't move. 52 minutes, talking the entire time so he wouldn't lose consciousness. I remember telling him about my mother, about how she wore those same pearl earrings every single day until cancer took her. It had been the only story I could think of that sounded calm, something ordinary enough to keep him alive. Thomas studied my face like someone trying to read the last line of a long letter. Then someone called his name from the stage. The music ended. Guests applauded the dance. Thomas glanced toward the dance floor, then back at me. Don't leave tonight, he said. Please. I have something I need to say. Before I could ask what he meant, he turned and walked quickly toward the far side of the tent. I watched him disappear through a side exit into the garden. At the time, I assumed he needed a moment. People sometimes do that when old memories surface. But later, I learned what really happened. Later, Thomas told me the whole story. He walked across the garden, past the lanterns, past the magnolia trees, all the way to the stone patio behind the main house. Then he took out his phone and called Bayfield Regional Medical Center. The hospital operator answered. He asked to be connected to the emergency department. Doctor. Rachel Klein was the attending physician on call. When she came on the line, Thomas introduced himself. Doctor, 4 years ago, I was involved in a highway accident on Interstate 94. A trauma nurse named Ava Mercer helped stabilize me before paramedics arrived. Was she working for you at that time? There was a pause on the line. Then Rachel's voice. Ava Mercer? Yes, she absolutely was. She was actually the one who coordinated your stabilization before EMS reached the scene. Thomas exhaled slowly. So it was her. Dr. Klein continued. To be honest with you, Mr. Caldwell, Ava probably saved your life. She held cervical spine stabilization manually for nearly an hour. That kind of endurance? Most people can't do it. He was silent for several seconds. Then he asked one more question. Did the hospital document it? Of course. There's a formal commendation letter from our trauma director. Could you send that to me? I can email it right now. 3 minutes later, Thomas Caldwell's phone buzzed. The email arrived. Subject line: Trauma Recognition, Nurse Ava Mercer. Attached: a one-page letter signed by the hospital director and chief surgeon. Clinical language: precise, unemotional, but powerful. Ava Mercer demonstrated extraordinary composure and clinical judgment while stabilizing a critically injured patient for 52 minutes prior to EMS arrival. Thomas read the letter twice. Then he called Margaret. I need the microphone tonight, he told her. There was a pause. What are you planning? Something long overdue. Back inside the reception tent, the party continued. The band had switched to jazz. Guests were dancing again. Lauren was glowing with satisfaction. Her wedding was unfolding exactly the way she had planned. Perfect lighting, perfect photos, perfect audience. She had no idea that outside in the garden, her entire narrative had just collapsed. I returned to my seat at table 21. The empty chairs were still empty. The elderly woman beside me had gone to the dance floor. For the first time that evening, I was completely alone. 10 minutes passed. Then someone sat down beside me. Margaret Caldwell. She placed her clutch on the table, smoothed the edge of her shawl, and looked directly at me. Thomas told me everything. I nodded slowly. I didn't know it was him until just now. She smiled gently. He's been looking for you for 4 years. I frowned. Looking for me? He hired investigators, private agencies. He contacted the highway patrol, even the hospital. But medical privacy laws prevented them from releasing your name. She paused. Every Thanksgiving he talks about the woman who kept him alive. He calls her the angel on Interstate 94. The phrase made me uncomfortable. I'm not an angel. I'm a nurse. Margaret studied me with an expression that was almost protective. That's exactly why he respects you. Across the room, Lauren was laughing with her bridesmaids. She looked completely relaxed, like the night belonged entirely to her. Margaret followed my gaze. Your sister doesn't seem very fond of you. I gave a small shrug. It's complicated. No, Margaret said quietly. It's actually very simple. She turned slightly toward me. Respect is not complicated. People either give it or they don't. We sat in silence for a moment. Then she asked, Did you know she told Ethan's family you have emotional issues? I nodded. Yes. Margaret's expression hardened slightly. I suspected something like that. Thomas and I both felt something didn't add up. She folded her hands on the tablecloth, and now we know why. The band finished another song. Guests applauded. Lauren raised a glass of champagne and kissed Ethan. Cameras flashed. Margaret glanced toward the stage. Thomas should be back soon. What's he going to do? I asked. Margaret looked at me with calm certainty. The right thing. 5 minutes later, the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please? The music faded. Conversations quieted. 231 guests turned toward the microphone. The MC smiled. The father of the groom would like to say a few words. Applause filled the tent. Lauren beamed. This was exactly what she had expected. The powerful father-in-law welcoming her into the Caldwell family. Another perfect moment. Thomas Caldwell walked slowly onto the stage. He took the microphone, looked across the crowd, and didn't smile. The room gradually fell silent. Most of you know that 4 years ago, I was involved in a serious accident. An 18-wheeler lost control on Interstate 94. My car was struck head-on. My legs were pinned. The steering wheel crushed my chest. Guests leaned forward. Even the waiters stopped moving. Thomas continued. For 52 minutes, before any ambulance arrived, one person kept me alive. A woman. She crawled through broken glass to reach me, held my head still so my spine wouldn't snap, talked to me the entire time so I wouldn't lose consciousness. Lauren's smile started to fade slightly. She hadn't expected this story. For 4 years. Thomas continued. I tried to find that woman. Hospitals couldn't release her name. Police reports didn't include it. So I never had the chance to thank her. He paused, looked slowly across the reception tent, until his eyes stopped, directly on me. Tonight, I finally found her. The silence that followed felt physical, heavy. 231 people waiting. Thomas raised one hand and pointed directly at table 21. The woman who saved my life is sitting right there. Every head in the room turned, toward the worst table in the tent, toward me. Lauren froze, completely still. Thomas spoke again. Her name is Ava Mercer. And suddenly, the entire wedding changed. At 9:54 p.m., 231 heads turned toward table 21, toward the worst table in the tent, toward me. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody even seemed to breathe. The band had stopped playing. The champagne glasses sat untouched. The only sound in the entire reception was the faint hum of the outdoor heaters. Thomas Caldwell stood at the microphone under the white lights, his hand still extended toward my table. Her name is Ava Mercer. I remained seated, not because I didn't hear him, but because I had spent 21 years training myself not to react when people looked at me. Across the room. Lauren's face had gone completely still. Her smile was gone. Her eyes flicked between Thomas and me, then to Ethan, then back to Thomas, trying to understand what was happening. Thomas continued speaking. 4 years ago, I was trapped inside my car during a highway accident, pinned under a crushed steering column, unable to move, unable to breathe properly. The doctors later told me that if my neck had shifted even 1 inch, my spinal cord would have been severed. He paused. But someone arrived before the ambulance. Someone crawled through shattered glass and rain. Someone held my head perfectly still for 52 minutes so my spine would not move. He lifted his phone. The screen glowed under the stage lights. Tonight, I confirmed it with Bayfield Regional Medical Center. They sent me the official commendation letter from the trauma department. The screen displayed the hospital document, large enough for the first several rows to see. Ava Mercer, RN, recognized for extraordinary composure and medical response during a highway trauma incident. A ripple moved through the crowd. Whispers, soft gasps. Then someone near the middle tables began clapping. 1 person, then 2, then 10. And suddenly the entire reception tent erupted into applause. 200 people standing, 200 people applauding. For the girl sitting alone at table 21. The girl Lauren had introduced the night before as just a nurse. I stood slowly, because at that moment, sitting down felt impossible. Thomas stepped away from the microphone, walked down the small stage stairs, and crossed the dance floor. The applause continued. People moved aside to let him pass. He stopped directly in front of me and extended his hand. Ava Mercer, on behalf of the Caldwell Foundation, I would like to personally thank you for saving my life. His voice softened. And I'd like everyone here to understand something. He turned slightly so the room could hear him clearly. There is no such thing as just a nurse. The applause intensified again. Behind him, Lauren stood frozen near the cake table, her hands still wrapped around a champagne glass. Her knuckles had turned white. Ethan was staring at her. Not the way a groom normally looks at his bride, but the way someone looks at a stranger. Confused, trying to connect 2 completely different versions of reality. Thomas turned back to me. I tried to find you for years, but the hospital couldn't release your name. He paused. Tonight, I finally get to say something I've been wanting to say for 4 years. Thank you for my life. The words were quiet, but in that moment, they carried more weight than anything else said that evening. The applause slowly faded. Guests returned to their seats, but the energy in the tent had changed completely. The center of attention was no longer the bride. It was the nurse she had tried to hide. Thomas returned to the stage and picked up the microphone again. "There's one more thing I want to say." Lauren stiffened. Margaret Caldwell folded her hands calmly in her lap. Thomas looked directly at the bride. Earlier this weekend, someone introduced Ava Mercer as just a nurse. His voice was calm but sharp. I want to explain what that actually means. Just a nurse means kneeling in broken glass on a freezing highway. Just a nurse means holding a dying stranger's head still while rain pours into your eyes. Just a nurse means refusing to leave, even when the smell of gasoline tells you the car could explode. He paused. The entire room was silent again. Just a nurse means choosing someone else's life over your own comfort. And that is the highest form of courage I have ever witnessed. He lowered the microphone, then said one final sentence. If every family had one, just a nurse, the world would be a far better place. The room stood again. Applause filled the tent a second time, this time louder, longer, across the dance floor. Ethan leaned toward Lauren. His voice was quiet, but the silence in the room made it carry. "You told me she had mental health problems." Lauren's lips parted slightly. Ethan continued. "You said your stepsister was unstable. That's why she stayed away from family events." His voice tightened. "You made me believe that." Lauren tried to speak. "Ethan, did you lie to me?" The entire room felt like a courtroom. 200 witnesses. Lauren's eyes filled with tears. Fast, practiced tears. Ethan, his voice was firm. "Did you lie?" She looked toward Vanessa, toward my father. Neither of them spoke. Lauren swallowed. "I was trying to protect the family image." The sentence landed like a glass breaking on marble. Margaret Caldwell stood slowly from her chair. Her voice was calm, controlled. "You fabricated a mental health story about your own sister, so you could hide her from our family." Lauren's shoulders stiffened. "You don't understand." "Oh, I understand perfectly." Margaret's tone sharpened. "You humiliated the woman who saved my husband's life, across the tent." My father stared at the floor. He hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, hadn't defended either of us. Exactly the way he had behaved my entire life. Lauren suddenly pointed toward me. She should have stayed invisible. A collective gasp swept across the reception. 200 people heard it. And in that moment, Lauren realized she had said the quiet part out loud. Thomas slowly lifted the microphone again. "Miss Whitmore, the way you treated Ava tonight says far more about you than it does about her." Lauren looked like she might collapse. Ethan stepped slightly away from her. Not dramatically, just one small step. But everyone in the room saw it. The distance between them had already begun. Thomas continued, "There's something else I'd like to announce tonight." He turned toward me again. 4 years ago, after the accident, I created the Caldwell First Responder Scholarship, $250,000 annually, for medical professionals who demonstrate extraordinary courage. Murmurs filled the room. Tonight, for the first time, I know exactly who deserves it. He stepped off the stage again, walked directly toward me, and extended a formal envelope. "Ava Mercer, you are the first recipient." The applause that followed shook the entire reception tent. 231 people standing again. The bride's spotlight, gone, replaced by a nurse from table 21. And standing under those lights, Lauren finally understood something she had never imagined. The story she spent years controlling was no longer hers. At 10:11 p.m., the wedding reception no longer belonged to Lauren. You could feel it in the room. The energy had shifted, not dramatically, not loudly, but unmistakably. People were still dancing, still drinking champagne, but the quiet conversations happening at the tables were no longer about the dress, or the flowers, or the band. They were about me, about the nurse at table 21, about the story Thomas Caldwell had just told. Lauren stood near the stage, holding the microphone like it had betrayed her. Her wedding, her guests, her moment. And somehow, the entire narrative had slipped out of her control. Ethan stepped closer to her. His voice was low but firm. "You told my parents Ava had emotional problems." Lauren's eyes moved quickly across the room, searching for support. Vanessa was standing beside the cake table, tense. My father still hadn't moved. Lauren forced a smile. Ethan. Right, Ethan. She corrected herself quickly. I was protecting the family image. Your image or the truth? Lauren inhaled sharply. You don't understand how important this wedding is. Ethan stared at her. You're right. I don't understand. Because I would never humiliate the person who saved my father's life. Lauren looked toward Thomas, then toward Margaret, then toward the guests. Everyone was watching. For the first time in her life, Lauren had an audience she couldn't control. She lowered the microphone. I need some air. She stepped off the stage and walked toward the terrace doors. Ethan followed. Not angrily, not aggressively, just steadily, like a man who needed answers. The glass doors closed behind them. Inside the tent, the band quietly resumed playing, but almost no one danced. 200 people were pretending not to watch the argument unfolding outside. Through the glass doors, their silhouettes were visible under the patio lights. Lauren's arms moved sharply. Ethan stood still. Then his hands went into his hair, a familiar gesture. Frustration. The kind that comes when a carefully built picture suddenly cracks. Fragments of their conversation drifted through the door. You lied to me. I told you what people needed to hear. People? My family. Lauren's voice sharpened. You think your parents would accept a family like mine? A regional hardware supply manager? A nurse working night shifts? Ethan's reply came slower. She saved my father's life. Lauren shook her head. She's not important. Ethan took a step back. No, he said quietly. She's the reason my father is alive to see this wedding. The music inside the tent continued, soft jazz. Waiters moved carefully between tables. But the reception felt suspended. Everyone sensed that something bigger was happening outside. At table 21, Margaret Caldwell was still sitting beside me. She watched the terrace doors calmly. Your sister has spent a long time controlling the narrative. I gave a small nod. Yes. Margaret folded her hands. That usually works, until reality interrupts. Across the room, Thomas was speaking quietly with several guests. Every few seconds, someone turned and looked at me again. Not with pity, with curiosity, respect. A feeling I wasn't used to receiving in rooms like this. After about 10 minutes, the terrace doors opened again. Ethan walked back inside first. Lauren followed. Her makeup had been touched up, but the redness around her eyes was still visible. The band stopped playing again, because everyone knew something was about to happen. Lauren walked slowly to the stage, picked up the microphone. Her hands trembled slightly. I owe someone an apology tonight. Her voice sounded thinner than before. She looked across the room, directly at me. Ava, I shouldn't have introduced you the way I did yesterday. I'm sorry. She paused. The room waited. Margaret Caldwell spoke from her chair. And the lies about her mental health. Lauren's composure cracked slightly. Yes, that too. I told Ethan's family things about Ava that weren't true. I shouldn't have done that. The apology landed quietly, not dramatic, not powerful, just words. The kind people say when there are 200 witnesses. Lauren lowered the microphone. The room stayed silent. She waited, probably expecting something. Forgiveness, a hug, a moment of reconciliation. I stayed where I was and simply nodded once. Nothing more. Because forgiveness isn't something you perform for an audience. It's something you decide in private. Ethan stepped forward next. Shelby, he stopped, corrected himself. Ava. My family owes you more than an apology. My father would not be alive without you. Thomas nodded once from across the room. Ethan continued. We intend to show our gratitude properly. Lauren stood beside him, quiet, still, for once in her life. She had no script. The reception resumed slowly after that. Guests began talking again. The band restarted. People danced. But the evening would never fully recover its original rhythm. Lauren's wedding had become something else. A public revelation. A recalibration. A story no one in that tent would ever forget. About 20 minutes later, I stepped outside for air. The garden behind the reception tent was quiet. Lanterns glowed along the pathways. The night air was cooler now, and peaceful. For the first time all evening, I felt like I could breathe normally. Footsteps sounded behind me. I turned. My father stood near the edge of the patio. Daniel Mercer, 58 years old, hardware store manager, a man who had watched his daughter disappear slowly for 20 years. Shelby, Ava, I corrected gently. He nodded. Right, Ava. He looked older than he had that afternoon, like the evening had aged him several years. I didn't know about the accident, about Thomas Caldwell. I know. You never asked. The words weren't angry, just factual. He stared out at the garden lights. I thought I was keeping the peace. You were keeping Lauren happy. He flinched slightly. That's not the same thing. He rubbed his face with both hands. I should have been there for you. Yes, you should have. Silence settled between us. Then he asked quietly, Can I fix it? I shook my head slowly. I don't know, but you can't fix 20 years with one conversation. He nodded. Tears filled his eyes, something I had never seen before. My father crying. I didn't hug him. I didn't move. I simply said the truth. I stopped expecting you to be my father a long time ago. He closed his eyes briefly. The words hit him harder than anything else that night. When I walked back toward the reception tent, he stayed behind on the patio, alone. Inside the ballroom, Thomas Caldwell was speaking quietly with the master of ceremonies again. Margaret watched from her chair. Lauren sat beside Ethan, her posture rigid. Guests still whispered about the nurse, the highway accident, the scholarship. But the most important thing had not happened yet, because Thomas Caldwell still had one more announcement to make. And when he picked up the microphone again, the entire wedding was about to change forever. At 10:46 p.m., Thomas Caldwell picked up the microphone again. The jazz band stopped mid-song. Conversations faded. 231 guests turned back toward the stage for the third time that night. But this time, the mood in the room was different. Earlier, there had been curiosity, then surprise. Now there was something quieter. Expectation. Thomas stood under the white lights with the calm composure of someone used to boardrooms and negotiations. But tonight, he wasn't speaking as a businessman. He was speaking as a man who had almost died. I know this evening has taken an unexpected turn, he began. His voice carried easily through the tent. Weddings are supposed to be about celebration. But sometimes, the most important moments in life happen when the script falls apart. A few guests nodded. Others leaned forward. Thomas continued. 4 years ago, when Ava Mercer held my head still on that highway, she had no idea who I was. She had no reason to stay. The car could have caught fire. Traffic was still moving around us. But she stayed. 52 minutes, in freezing rain, until the paramedics arrived. He paused, looking across the room. And in those 52 minutes, she didn't ask my name. She didn't ask what I did for a living. She didn't ask if I could repay her. She just did what nurses do. She protected a life. Silence filled the tent again. Because the truth, when spoken clearly, has a weight that applause doesn't. Thomas lowered the microphone slightly. When someone saves your life, he continued, you spend the rest of your life wondering how to repay a debt like that. He turned toward me. For 4 years, I've been trying to answer that question. I found part of the answer tonight. The Caldwell First Responder Scholarship will now be permanently renamed. He paused again. The Ava Mercer Trauma Nursing Fellowship. A wave of surprised murmurs spread through the crowd. Thomas continued. Every year, one trauma nurse will receive funding for advanced medical training in Ava's name. $250,000 annually. The first recipient, he smiled slightly, is obviously Ava herself. Applause erupted again, but this time it felt different. Not just admiration, respect, something solid. Across the room, Lauren sat very still, her shoulders stiff. Her wedding had become the setting for someone else's legacy. Ethan looked toward me, then toward his father, then back toward Lauren. You could almost see the calculations happening behind his eyes. Because suddenly the story he'd been told about me didn't match the reality unfolding in front of him. Thomas finished his announcement, then stepped down from the stage again. The music resumed quietly. Guests returned to their conversations. But something had changed permanently. Because now my name existed in that room. Not as Lauren's stepsister, not as the nurse she tried to hide, but as the woman who saved Thomas Caldwell's life. And for the first time that evening, Lauren had nothing left to diminish. Margaret found me again near the edge of the dance floor. My husband can be very dramatic, she said with a small smile. But he means every word. I looked toward Thomas, speaking with several guests. I never expected any of this. Most people who do what you did don't. She studied me carefully. Ava, do you know why Thomas respected you immediately? Because he remembered the pearls. I frowned slightly. The pearls? Margaret nodded. While you were holding his head still that night, you kept describing them. You said they were the only thing your mother left you. You said they reminded you to stay calm, because calm hands save lives. The memory hit me like a distant echo. I had said that. I remembered now. It had been something simple to focus on, something gentle to keep a dying man awake. Margaret smiled softly. He's carried that story with him for 4 years. Across the room, Lauren stood up suddenly. She walked quickly toward the hallway leading to the restrooms. Vanessa followed immediately behind her, the same way she had done my entire childhood, protecting, managing, repairing. Ethan remained standing near the stage, watching them leave. His expression had changed. The easy confidence of a groom had disappeared, replaced by something more thoughtful, more cautious. He walked slowly toward my table, stopped a few feet away. Ava, his voice was careful. I owe you an apology, too. You don't owe me anything. Yes, I do. He glanced briefly toward the hallway where Lauren had disappeared. I believed things that weren't true about you. He took a breath. And tonight I realized I never bothered asking if they were. I nodded once. That happens more often than people think. Ethan looked toward the stage again. My father rarely speaks like that in public. He chooses his words carefully, which means every word he said tonight was deliberate. I knew what he meant. Thomas Caldwell had just made a very public statement, not just about me, about values, about respect, about the kind of character he expected around his family. Ethan looked back at me. Thank you for saving him. Then he added quietly, if you hadn't. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Across the ballroom, the restroom door opened again. Lauren stepped out. Her makeup was flawless again. Perfect. Reconstructed. But the tension in her posture was obvious. Vanessa whispered something into her ear. Lauren nodded, then walked slowly back toward the center of the reception. But the way people looked at her had changed. Not hostile, just different, curious, evaluating. The same way society looks at someone once the illusion cracks. Lauren approached Ethan. They spoke quietly. Then she glanced across the room, directly at me. Our eyes met. For a long moment, neither of us looked away. Then Lauren said something softly to Ethan. He shook his head once, firmly. The music continued. Guests danced again. But the center of gravity in that reception tent had shifted permanently. Because Lauren had spent years building a story, and tonight, the truth had walked in uninvited. I stepped outside again for a moment. The night air was cooler now. The lanterns along the garden path flickered softly. For the first time all evening, everything felt quiet, peaceful. Behind me, the reception music faded through the tent walls. Footsteps approached again, but this time it wasn't my father. It was Thomas Caldwell. He stood beside me, hands in his pockets, looking out at the dark garden. "You know something strange?" he said. "For 4 years I thought about the nurse who saved me. I imagined meeting her again, but I never imagined it would happen at my son's wedding." I smiled slightly. Life rarely follows a script. Thomas nodded. "True." He looked at me carefully. "Your sister didn't know who you were to me." "No, she didn't." He exhaled slowly. "That's unfortunate for her." We stood there quietly for a moment. Then Thomas added something I didn't fully understand at the time. "But Ava." Tonight wasn't the end of this story. It was the beginning. And what he did next, 2 days later, would change Lauren's life far more than anything that had happened at the wedding. 2 days after the wedding, at 8:12 Monday morning, I walked into Bayfield Regional Trauma Center, and everything looked exactly the same. Which is the strange thing about life-changing events. The world rarely pauses to acknowledge them. The fluorescent lights hummed. The smell of antiseptic lingered in the hallway. A paramedic was wheeling in a patient with a fractured wrist, and the trauma board already had 6 names on it. My name badge still read the same thing it always had: Ava Mercer, RN BSN. No one here cared about the wedding, or the speech, or the 200 people who had watched Thomas Caldwell change the story of that night. The ER had its own gravity. A teenager came in with a head injury from a bicycle crash. A warehouse worker arrived with a crushed hand. By 10:30 a.m., we had a cardiac arrest in room 4. The rhythm of compressions and oxygen masks and shouted instructions took over. Because when someone's heart stops, nobody asks about family drama. They ask for steady hands. The man survived. When his pulse finally returned, Dr. Rachel Klein stepped back from the bed and pulled off her gloves. "Nice work, Ava." She gave me that small nod surgeons give when something difficult goes right. Afterward, we stood in the hallway reviewing charts. Rachel leaned against the wall. "So, your life turned into a movie this weekend." I sighed. "Apparently." She smirked slightly. "You know Thomas Caldwell called the hospital again this morning." I blinked. "He did?" Rachel nodded. "He wanted to personally thank the trauma department, and he asked if we had documentation about your performance during that highway incident." I hesitated. "You sent it to him?" "Of course. He already had the commendation letter." "But he requested the full incident report. Why?" Rachel shrugged. "He didn't say, but when billionaires ask for paperwork, people usually provide it." The rest of the shift passed quickly. By the time I left the hospital, it was nearly sunset. My phone had 6 missed calls, all from my father. He had never called me 6 times in one day before. I didn't return the calls. Instead, I drove home. My apartment looked the same as it had the day before the wedding. Small kitchen, 2 mismatched chairs, a stack of nursing journals on the table. Life continued. Around 7:20 p.m., the doorbell rang. When I opened the door, a courier stood in the hallway, holding a large envelope. "Delivery for Ava Mercer." The envelope was thick, cream-colored, heavy. The return address read, Caldwell Development Group. I closed the door and sat down at the kitchen table before opening it. Inside were 3 documents. The first was a formal letter from the Caldwell Foundation. The Ava Mercer Trauma Nursing Fellowship had already been registered legally. $250,000 per year, beginning immediately. The second document made my hands pause. It was a contract. Full tuition coverage for an advanced trauma certification program through Johns Hopkins. 3-year fellowship, all expenses paid. The third document was handwritten, not typed, handwritten. Ava, you gave me 52 minutes of your life on a rainy highway without knowing my name. The least I can do is give you the opportunity to save thousands more. Call me when you're ready. Thomas Caldwell. I sat there for a long time staring at the letter, because until that moment, the wedding had felt like something that happened to me. This was different. This was real. My phone buzzed, a text message from Margaret Caldwell. Thomas hopes the documents arrived safely. I typed back, "They did, thank you." Her reply came quickly. "Dinner Thursday, just family, if you're comfortable." I stared at the words, "just family," a phrase that had always meant something complicated in my life. But for the first time, it didn't feel like a trap. That night, another message arrived, from an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but curiosity won. The text read, "Ava, this is Ethan. I'd like to speak with you if you're willing." I waited a moment before answering. "What about?" 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. About the truth, about my wife, and about something my father discovered after the wedding. My chest tightened slightly. Discovered? Another pause, then Ethan's reply arrived. "The stories Lauren told about you weren't the only ones she fabricated. My father asked his legal team to review several things. Things connected to the wedding, things connected to money, and Ava." His next message appeared slowly. "What they found is going to create a much bigger problem for Lauren than a bad speech at a wedding." I read the text twice, then once more, because suddenly the story of that wedding wasn't over. It was expanding, and the quiet investigation Thomas Caldwell had started on a garden patio 2 nights earlier was about to expose something none of us had expected, something that would make Lauren's humiliation look small by comparison. Before I continue, I want to ask you something. If you were in my place right now, would you meet Ethan and hear the truth? Or would you walk away and let karma handle it? Tell me in the comments, because the next chapter is where the real consequences begin. 3 days after the wedding, at exactly 4:18 p.m., I met Ethan Caldwell at a quiet coffee shop 2 blocks from Bayfield Regional. It wasn't the kind of place someone like Ethan usually visited. No marble counters, no polished suits, just wooden tables, chipped mugs, and a barista who looked like she'd been working since sunrise. I arrived first, sat near the window, ordered black coffee, and waited. Ethan walked in 7 minutes later. No tie, sleeves rolled up. He looked like a man who hadn't slept much. When he spotted me, he hesitated briefly, then walked over and sat down across from me. "Thank you for meeting me. You said your father found something." Ethan exhaled slowly. "Yes." He rubbed the bridge of his nose. "My father doesn't like unanswered questions. After the wedding, he asked his legal team to review several financial details related to the event." "What kind of details?" "The wedding expenses." That surprised me. "Thomas paid for most of it." "Exactly," Ethan nodded. "And that's where things started to look strange." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thin folder. My stomach tightened slightly. Inside were printed documents, invoices, bank transfer confirmations, contract agreements. Lauren told us the wedding would cost around $600,000. That sounded believable. The Caldwell family could afford it easily. But when my father reviewed the accounts, Ethan slid the first document across the table. The total wasn't $600,000. It was $942,000. I stared at the number. That's a big difference. Yes, and that wasn't the part that bothered him most. Ethan slid another document forward. Several vendor contracts had been routed through a private event company, Whitmore Hospitality Consulting. The name sounded familiar. Vanessa's business. Ethan nodded. "Your stepmother's company. But here's the problem. According to the invoices, Whitmore Hospitality Consulting charged a 35% coordination fee on every vendor contract. Florists, lighting, music, catering, even the tent rental. I looked at him slowly. Lauren told your father those were standard industry fees? Yes, but my father owns commercial properties that host large events all the time. He knows exactly what standard fees look like. He tapped the paper. And 35% isn't standard. It's massive. I did the quick math in my head. $300,000, approximately. Ethan nodded again. That's roughly how much? Silence settled between us. Then I asked the obvious question. You're saying Lauren and Vanessa skimmed money from your father's wedding budget? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened the folder again and slid one final document across the table. A bank transfer. 3 days before the wedding. $312,000. Transferred from Whitmore Hospitality Consulting to a personal account belonging to Lauren Whitmore. My breath caught slightly. Ethan leaned back in his chair. My father doesn't mind spending money, but he hates being lied to, especially when someone manipulates his trust. I looked up at him. Does Lauren know he found this? No, not yet. My father wanted to confirm everything first. Which meant he hired a forensic accountant yesterday morning. I exhaled slowly, because now the situation had moved far beyond family drama. This was fraud. Ethan studied my reaction. You didn't know about any of this? No, of course not. He nodded. I didn't think so. A few seconds passed, then I asked quietly, what happens now? Ethan's answer was calm, but serious. That depends on Lauren. If she admits what she did, my father might treat it as a civil matter, return the money, close the books, and move on. And if she doesn't? He held my gaze. Then it becomes criminal. The word hung in the air, heavy, unavoidable. Outside the coffee shop, a bus passed slowly. Inside the cafe, the barista turned on the espresso machine. Life moving normally. While the consequences of a $900,000 wedding unfolded quietly at a small wooden table. Ethan closed the folder. There's another reason I wanted to meet you. I waited. He leaned forward slightly. You deserve to know something. What? When Lauren first told me about you, she said you rarely attended family events because you struggled with emotional instability. I nodded. I remember. He shook his head slowly. After the wedding, I started questioning everything she'd told me. So I looked at her phone. And? Ethan's jaw tightened. I found messages between her and Vanessa, planning exactly how to present you to my family. The words stung, even though I had expected them. Lauren wrote that if my parents thought you were unstable, they wouldn't ask too many questions about why you weren't around. I said nothing, because sometimes silence is the only honest response. Ethan continued. She also wrote something else, something that bothered me even more. He paused. She said your job made her uncomfortable. Why? Because you worked harder than anyone else in the family, and she hated the idea that people might respect you more than her. The sentence landed softly, but it explained everything. Every comment, every introduction, every just a nurse moment. Lauren hadn't been embarrassed by my job. She had been threatened by it. Ethan closed the folder. My father will speak with Lauren tonight, at our house. Just the immediate family. And me. I nodded slowly. He hesitated, then added one more sentence. My father also asked if you'd be willing to attend. I blinked. Why would he want me there? Because, Ethan said quietly, you're the only person in this situation who never lied. I leaned back in my chair, thinking. If I walked away, the investigation would still happen. The truth would still surface. But something about Thomas Caldwell's voice at the wedding came back to me. No one gets to reduce the person who saved my life to a punchline. And suddenly, I realized something. For 20 years, I had stayed quiet, stayed invisible, accepted whatever version of me my family wanted to present. But silence only protects the people telling the lie. I looked at Ethan. What time tonight? 7. I nodded once. Then I'll be there. Ethan stood, collected the folder, and paused before leaving. For what it's worth, I'm glad you saved my father. I gave a small smile. So am I. Because without that accident 4 years ago, none of this truth would be coming out now. Ethan walked out of the cafe. I sat alone for a moment, looking at the empty chair across from me, and thinking about what would happen in a few hours. Because by the end of that night, Lauren Whitmore would face something she had spent her entire life avoiding. Consequences. And the confrontation that was about to happen inside the Caldwell house would make the wedding look like a rehearsal. At exactly 7:03 p.m. that evening, I pulled my Honda Civic into the circular driveway of the Caldwell estate, the same driveway where valet attendants had lined up luxury cars 3 nights earlier. But tonight, there were only 4 vehicles. Thomas Caldwell's black Mercedes, Margaret's silver Range Rover, Ethan's dark blue Audi, and Lauren's white Lexus. No photographers, no musicians, no guests. Just the people whose lives were about to collide. The house looked different without the wedding decorations. Quiet, almost severe, the kind of silence that settles over a place before a storm breaks. I sat in the car for a moment with my hands resting on the steering wheel. 20 years of family dynamics had trained me to avoid rooms like the one waiting inside. Rooms where truths finally get spoken. But Thomas Caldwell had asked me to come, and something inside me understood why. When you spend years being erased, the first time someone insists you stay in the room matters. I stepped out of the car. The front door opened before I reached it. Margaret Caldwell stood in the doorway. Her expression was calm, but serious. "Thank you for coming, Ava." She stepped aside. Inside, the house smelled faintly of wood polish and coffee. The living room lights were dim, and everyone was already seated. Thomas Caldwell sat at the long dining table, a folder of documents in front of him. Ethan sat beside him. Lauren sat across the table, Vanessa next to her. My father sat near the end, looking like a man who had accidentally walked into a courtroom. When I entered the room, Lauren's eyes snapped toward me. "You invited her?" The words came out sharper than she intended. Thomas didn't raise his voice. "Yes." Lauren laughed once, a short, brittle sound. "Of course you did." She looked at me. "This is unbelievable." Margaret closed the door quietly behind me. Ava deserves to hear the truth. Lauren's posture stiffened. "What truth?" Thomas opened the folder slowly. Several printed documents slid across the table. Vendor invoices, bank transfers, contract agreements. Lauren's confidence didn't disappear immediately. It rarely does when someone has spent years controlling a narrative. She leaned back slightly. "If this is about the wedding speech, it isn't." Thomas's voice was calm, direct. "It's about the wedding finances." Lauren's eyes flicked briefly toward Vanessa, then back to Thomas. "Everything was handled through my mother's event company." "Correct." Thomas slid the first document toward her, which charged a 35% coordination fee on every vendor contract. Lauren didn't touch the paper. "That's standard event management." Thomas shook his head slowly. "No, it isn't." Silence filled the room. Thomas continued. "The total cost of the wedding was $942,000. Lauren said nothing, but Vanessa spoke. "The event grew larger than expected. That happens." Thomas nodded slightly. "Yes, it does." Then he slid another document across the table. A bank transfer confirmation. $312,000, transferred from Whitmore Hospitality Consulting to your personal account, 3 days before the wedding. Lauren's fingers tightened on the edge of the table. Her voice dropped. That money was a consulting payment. Ethan spoke for the first time. "Lauren, don't." She looked at him sharply. "Don't what?" "Don't lie again." The words hit the room harder than shouting would have. Lauren stood abruptly. "This is ridiculous." Thomas didn't move. His eyes remained steady. "Sit down." For a moment, it looked like Lauren might refuse. Then, she slowly lowered herself back into the chair. Thomas folded his hands together. "My legal team reviewed every vendor contract connected to the wedding, every invoice, every payment." He looked directly at Vanessa. "Your company inflated vendor costs, then redirected the surplus funds to Lauren's personal account." Vanessa's voice sharpened. "You're accusing us of fraud?" "I'm not accusing," Thomas replied calmly. "I'm stating facts." The room fell completely silent. Lauren's breathing had grown slightly faster. "You can't prove anything." Thomas tapped the folder. "Forensic accountants can," Ethan added quietly. "The bank records are already documented." Lauren's eyes filled with anger. "This is unbelievable. After everything my family did to make this wedding perfect." Thomas interrupted gently. "Your family didn't pay for this wedding. I did." The words landed like stone. Lauren looked around the table, searching for someone to defend her. Vanessa's jaw was tight. My father looked down at his hands. Finally, Lauren said the sentence that changed everything. "It's not illegal." Thomas leaned back slightly. "Lauren, misrepresenting financial contracts and transferring funds under false pretenses is the legal definition of fraud." The word hung in the air. Fraud. Lauren's composure cracked. Her voice rose. "This is because of her." She pointed at me. "Ever since the wedding, you've been trying to humiliate me." Thomas's expression didn't change. "Ava didn't investigate your finances. My accountants did." Lauren turned toward Ethan. "You're letting this happen?" Ethan's answer was quiet. "I asked you earlier if you lied to me. You said you were protecting the family image. Now I know what you meant." Lauren's shoulders shook with anger. "You're choosing them over your wife?" "I'm choosing the truth." The sentence ended the argument. Lauren stood again, but this time she didn't shout. Her voice dropped, cold. "What do you want?" Thomas answered immediately. "The money returned, every dollar, within 48 hours. And if we don't?" Thomas closed the folder slowly. "Then my attorneys file a criminal complaint." Vanessa inhaled sharply. "You wouldn't send your daughter-in-law to jail." Thomas's voice remained steady. "I wouldn't, but the district attorney might." Silence filled the room again, because for the first time, Lauren Whitmore had run out of ways to control the story, and the consequences she had spent her entire life avoiding were finally sitting across the table, waiting for her answer. But the most surprising part of that night was what my father said next. Because after 20 years of silence, Daniel Mercer finally spoke. And what he said changed everything. At 7:41 p.m., for the first time in 20 years, my father spoke before anyone else in the room. Until that moment, Daniel Mercer had been sitting at the far end of the table, quiet, hands folded, the same posture he had worn my entire childhood whenever conflict appeared. Silence had always been his shield, but something about that night had changed. Maybe it was the documents on the table. Maybe it was the word fraud hanging in the air. Or maybe it was finally seeing the consequences of every time he chose comfort over truth. He cleared his throat. "Lauren." Everyone at the table turned toward him, even Thomas. My father rarely spoke in rooms like this. His voice sounded rough. "You should return the money." Lauren stared at him. Disbelief spread slowly across her face. "Excuse me?" He met her gaze. "If you took money that wasn't yours, you need to give it back." Vanessa's chair scraped slightly against the floor. "Daniel, stay out of this." My father didn't look at her. "No." His voice was quiet, but steady. "I should have stopped staying out of things years ago." Lauren laughed sharply. "You're taking their side?" He shook his head. "I'm taking the side of what's right." The sentence stunned the room, because for 20 years, Daniel Mercer had avoided choosing sides. Lauren leaned forward. "Dad, you don't even understand what's happening." "I understand enough," he said. You lied to Ethan's family. You lied about Ava. And now it looks like you lied about money. Vanessa's voice rose. Daniel, this is not the time. Actually, he interrupted softly, it is exactly the time. He finally looked at me. For a moment, neither of us spoke, but the expression in his eyes was something I had never seen before. Regret. Not the shallow regret of someone apologizing after being caught. Real regret. The kind that arrives years too late. He turned back to Lauren. You should apologize to your sister. Lauren stared at him like she had never seen him before. Apologize? For what? For everything. Her face hardened instantly. I am not apologizing to her again. You already did once tonight, Ethan said quietly. Lauren snapped her head toward him. That wasn't an apology. That was humiliation. Margaret Caldwell spoke calmly. Sometimes they look the same. Lauren pushed her chair back. This entire situation is absurd. She looked at Thomas. You invited her into this family drama. You're accusing my mother of fraud. And now my own father is siding with you? Thomas answered evenly. I didn't create this situation. Your choices did. Lauren's composure cracked completely. Fine. You want the truth? She pointed toward me again. Ava has always been a problem. Every time someone praises her job, every time someone talks about nurses like they're heroes. She paused. Her voice grew sharper. Do you know how exhausting that is? The room went silent again. Lauren continued. I spent my whole life building something impressive. The right schools, the right career, the right people. And then there's Ava, working night shifts, covered in blood, saving strangers. And suddenly everyone thinks that's noble. The bitterness in her voice was unmistakable. I looked at her quietly. Lauren, you could have respected my work without tearing it down. She shook her head. You don't understand. Of course I do, I said. You weren't embarrassed by me. You were afraid someone might respect me more than you. The words landed harder than shouting. Lauren froze. Ethan exhaled slowly. That's exactly what it looked like. Lauren's voice dropped to a whisper. You're all acting like she's perfect. No one said that, Thomas replied, but she didn't lie to anyone here. Lauren looked around the table, searching again for support, but Vanessa had grown quiet. My father sat still. Ethan's expression remained firm. Margaret watched calmly. Lauren realized something in that moment. For the first time in her life, the room was no longer under her control. She leaned back slowly. Fine. Her voice was flat now. I'll return the money. Thomas nodded once. 48 hours. Lauren looked directly at him. And after that? After that, Thomas said. We consider the matter closed. Lauren gave a short laugh. Closed, yes. But some things don't close that easily. She stood up again. This time, she didn't look at anyone except me. You think you won tonight? I shook my head gently. This was never a competition. She studied my face, trying to find anger, triumph, anything. But there was nothing there, just calm. And that seemed to disturb her more than anything else. Lauren turned and walked toward the door. Vanessa followed. The sound of the front door closing echoed through the house. The room stayed silent for several seconds. Then Thomas closed the folder. That went about as well as expected. Ethan rubbed his forehead. I'm sorry you had to sit through that. I looked at him. It wasn't the worst family dinner I've attended. Margaret smiled faintly. My father stood slowly. He looked at me. Ava. Yes? I meant what I said earlier, about being sorry. I nodded once. I know. But understanding something is different than fixing it. He swallowed. I know that too. Thomas stood up from the table. Ava, thank you for coming tonight. I wasn't sure you would. You asked. That matters. He smiled slightly. Then he said something that surprised everyone in the room. Margaret and I are hosting Thanksgiving in 3 weeks. We would like you to join us. A seat at the table, he added, with your name spelled correctly. For a moment, no one spoke, because invitations can mean very different things depending on who offers them. In my father's house, a seat at the table had always been conditional, but this invitation felt different. I nodded slowly. I'd like that. Margaret smiled warmly. Good, because Thomas has already told half the city about the nurse who saved his life. Everyone laughed quietly. The tension in the room finally eased, but the story wasn't finished yet, because the real consequences of Lauren's choices would arrive 2 days later, when the bank transfer records became official, and when the person who had spent her entire life controlling the narrative realized the world was no longer listening to her version of it. 2 days later, at 2:16 p.m. on a quiet Wednesday afternoon, my phone buzzed while I was charting patient notes in the trauma ward. The message was from Ethan. 3 words. The money's returned. I stared at the screen for a moment, then I typed back. All of it? His reply came 10 seconds later. Every dollar. $312,000 transferred back to the Caldwell Foundation this morning. The investigation is closed. I set the phone down and finished entering the patient's discharge notes, because even when someone's life falls apart across town, the emergency department keeps moving. Room 3 needed stitches. Room 5 had a possible concussion, and an ambulance had just radioed in a cardiac arrest arriving in 4 minutes. Life doesn't pause for justice. It just continues. Later that evening, after my shift ended, I sat alone in the hospital locker room. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly above the metal lockers. My reflection in the mirror looked the same as it had the week before. Same tired eyes, same navy scrubs, same pearl earrings. But something inside me had shifted. Not victory, not revenge. Something quieter. Closure. My phone buzzed again. This time it was my father. A text message. I heard about the money. I'm proud of you. I read the message twice, then locked the screen. Because pride arrives differently when it shows up 20 years late. I wasn't angry anymore, but forgiveness doesn't rush either. Some things grow slowly, like trust, or like boundaries. That weekend another envelope arrived in my mailbox, cream-colored, heavy paper. Inside was a handwritten note. Ava, our Thanksgiving table seats 12. Margaret insists that one chair remain empty until you arrive. Your name will be on the place card, spelled correctly, Thomas Caldwell. I pinned the card to my refrigerator, right beside my hospital schedule. 3 weeks later, Thanksgiving afternoon arrived, clear and cold. I drove the same Honda Civic up the Caldwell driveway, but this time the house didn't feel intimidating. It felt welcoming. Margaret opened the door before I knocked. You made it. Inside, the dining room table was already set, 12 chairs, 12 place cards, and one card near the center, Ava Mercer, perfectly spelled. Thomas stood when I entered the room. Ethan smiled from across the table. The atmosphere felt warm, genuine. No performances, no narratives, just people sitting down to share a meal. For the first time in years, I wasn't the extra chair. Dinner moved easily. Conversation flowed, stories about travel, business, medicine. At one point, Thomas raised his glass. To second chances. Everyone clinked glasses. I noticed something quietly meaningful. No one mentioned Lauren. No one needed to, because karma rarely arrives as punishment. Sometimes it arrives as distance. I later heard through Ethan that Lauren and Vanessa had closed Whitmore Hospitality Consulting 2 weeks after returning the money. Their social circle had grown smaller. Several of the same people who once admired Lauren's perfect image suddenly stopped answering her calls. Reputation is fragile. Once people see the truth behind it, they rarely forget. But I didn't celebrate that, because revenge had never been the goal. Peace was. The following Monday, I returned to Bayfield Regional. Same ER, same chaos, same unpredictable rhythm. But something inside me had settled. That afternoon, a young nurse named Kelly stopped me in the hallway. Hey, I heard about what happened at that wedding. Word travels fast in hospitals. I smiled. Hospitals run on gossip and caffeine. She laughed. Then she said something that stayed with me. You know, when I was in nursing school, people kept saying nurses are just assistants to doctors. But after hearing your story, it reminded me why I chose this job. I shook my head gently. It's not my story that matters. It's the work, helping people when they need it most. Kelly nodded. Still, it's nice knowing someone stood up for us. Later that night, the ER grew quiet for a moment. One of those rare pauses between emergencies. I stepped outside the hospital entrance. The autumn air felt cool against my skin. For a moment, I thought about the highway, the rain, the broken glass. 52 minutes kneeling beside a stranger whose name I didn't know. I hadn't done it for recognition, or gratitude, or scholarships. I did it because someone needed help. That's all nursing has ever been. Showing up, doing the work, and sometimes, if you're lucky, the right people eventually see it. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, or underestimated because of what you do for a living, I want to ask you something. Would you stay silent like I did for so many years? Or would you speak up sooner? Tell me in the comments. And if this story meant something to you, take a second to like the video. It helps more people hear it. And if you want to hear more stories like this, check the playlist in the description. My name is Ava Mercer. I'm just a nurse. And that has turned out to be more than enough.